and population. And I'm the director of the UCLA program in population and reproductive health. And Frankie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Frankie. I am the Bixby program assistant for the Bixby program, and I'm also a first-year MPH student in the CHS department.
And one day we were brainstorming about what would be interesting Bixby lectures, and I remembered, right before the pandemic, I had been given some advice to Stina Rosenquist, who was at that time part of the, or maybe still, I'll let her introduce herself, what her roles are now. But so she was working with the Los Angeles Reproductive Freedom Group and wanted to do a study. And I said, I wonder what happened with that study. And so I contacted her, and sure enough, there was this study that you're going to be hearing all about. And so that's how this whole thing arose. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Xochitl Lopez Ayala and Stina Rosenquist to lead this presentation. And then at the end, we'll have time for questions and answers in the last 10 or 15 minutes.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Frankie. Hi, welcome everyone. Today we're presenting Seeking LGBTQ+ Reproductive Justice in LA County, then and now. We also want to recognize that in light of the leaked draft decision last night, nothing has changed. Abortion is still legal. We're here to support people in accessing abortion no matter what. We've known this day was coming, and we're doing everything in our power to be prepared to meet this moment. And we're merely getting a sneak peek of what decision day and post-decision day will look like. Next slide, please. So I'm Xochitl Lopez Ayala. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the policy advocacy coordinator for California's only abortion fund, Access Reproductive Justice. And with me today is Stina Rosenquist. She also used she, her pronouns, as the policy supervisor for the LA Homeless Services Authority. We're giving this report on behalf of the LA Coalition for Reproductive Justice, also known as LACRJ. It is a network of grassroots, community-based, women of color-led organizations and reproductive health advocates in the Los Angeles area. The coalition leverages the expertise of our member base to enhance the leadership of reproductive justice organizations and promote reproductive justice strategies. The coalition also advocates decision makers to achieve reproductive justice for all of LA County residents. Before we start, I want to identify some key terms for us. LGBTQIA Two-Spirit stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, intersex, asexual, and Two-Spirit. We also recognize sexual orientation is who you go to bed with, and gender orientation is who you go to bed as. These are independent terms, and there's a comprehensive list of sexual orientations that we also recognize. For the purpose of this presentation, we acknowledge the different intersections of the full definition. We'll be using the terms LGBTQ or LGBTQ+ today. We also might use the term BIPOC, that stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. So this report comes from an interesting perspective. It was pre-pandemic, started in the summer of 2019 and released in the beginning of March of 2020, right as the pandemic went into full swing. And we wanted to dive into if there has been any change in LGBTQ health since this report was released and as the COVID-19 pandemic continues on. Today, we're going to go over background, report overview, recommendations, and a current update. And I will pass it over to Stina.
Oh my goodness, sorry. Sometimes the presenter mode, I lose track of my unmute button. Hello, everyone. So again, my name is Stina Rosenquist. I currently work for LA Homeless Services Authority, but today I'm here on behalf of the LA Coalition for Reproductive Justice. So I was hired by the coalition to do this report. Again, we started it in 2019. It was literally, we started kind of our true advocacy meetings right around March 5th to 10th or something, 2020. So unfortunately, it made its way into places of power just as COVID was unfolding. And it really was put on the back burner pretty quickly. So I'm going to give you an overview of this report. And then again, we'll kind of talk about maybe what has and hasn't changed since then. So first, on just a little bit of background, we've already used the term reproductive justice a lot. We want to make sure that we define that term. So the definition was developed by Black women and by the organization Sister Song. So reproductive justice is the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. So we're thinking kind of beyond, this more narrow idea of reproductive health, reproductive rights, and into reproductive justice, which is really the intersection that LACRJ tries to work at. And it's the intersection of health equity, economic equity, and seeks to consider other social determinants of health. So with that in mind, we set out in the summer of 2019, to start this report to research the complex oppressions experienced by LGBTQ individuals, to do really kind of a landscape analysis, and to use our RJ lens to elevate and center the experiences and needs of LGBTQ plus women and non-binary individuals. I just want to note that this report was supported by a lot of people via their time and effort, including Dr. Paula Tavro, who's here today. But monetarily, it was supported by the LA County Board of Supervisors. So we're very thankful for that. So getting into the report itself, we spoke to advocates. We wanted to seek, and when I say advocates, we spoke to a wide variety of individuals who were working on at reproductive justice organizations, advocacy, research, all sorts of different roles. We wanted to identify gaps and priorities for investment. We wanted to build partnerships with these organizations, and we wanted to use the findings of this report to engage policymakers to advance more LGBTQ plus inclusive policies. So to do that, we worked as a coalition to develop an initial list. So again, different communities of focus, varied methods of change, and we had 23 interviews with local advocates. We then first we transcribed those interviews and then we coded them and sought common themes. I will note on this slide, obviously, there are huge limitations of this study, right? It was a small sample. 23 is a very small sample. It was made up of employees of reproductive justice organizations, not necessarily the individuals being served by those organizations, although we kind of when I spoke to these interviewees, I was hearing both about their experience as a professional in this space and oftentimes about their personal experiences with seeking reproductive health or sexual health services in LA County. So we also recognize that we did not cover every intersection within the movement. 23 interviews, you can't get there. I will call out specifically one that I know some individuals raised, which was that we were seeking to speak with someone from an organization focusing on kind of aging LGBTQ plus populations. We weren't able to do that, but we were able to connect with organizations who were at the time and maybe now actually really have set up programs focused on that population. So I have 2 slides here of the organizations we interviewed. I'm just going to kind of have them up for a second and then move on. I believe that all of you received via email this full report. And so you can actually go into the report and see the names of the individuals we interviewed, the full list of organizations, and can kind of look more closely there. But just a little overview of the diverse organizations that we spoke to. So I want to get into the reproductive justice gaps, right? This was a huge emphasis of our report. If you go look at the report, another thing you'll find in there that I'm not going to talk about today is a literature review that demonstrates what I think all of us here today already know, which is that there are disparities between LGBTQ plus communities and cisgender heterosexual individuals. And also there are disparities within LGBTQ plus communities compounded for people of color and transgender individuals. So the purpose of today is we're going to talk through what advocates themselves, or these interviewees themselves, identified. So these are the gaps that I heard again and again from advocates, and I've grouped them by theme. So these are the 4 themes here today: invisibility and lack of representation, competency and gatekeeping, funding inequality, and unaddressed social determinants of health. So on this first theme of invisibility and lack of representation, and I think actually I'll pause here for a second and say, I think something that was, I don't think anyone is going to be entirely surprised by any of what I'm about to say, by these gaps. I think some of it may be slightly new, but I think it's not surprising, I'm guessing, for a group that chose to come to this lecture series. But I think what was really exciting for me and for the individuals that I spoke to and for LACRJ was that actually this hasn't been like these individuals hadn't talked about this before in a way where they could then see their thoughts really written down and reflected back, and they could hear kind of how their thoughts lined up with others across LA County. So just want to give that little caveat. But so on this first theme, invisibility and lack of representation, this is the idea, kind of the sub-themes under this, the idea that when individuals were entering a medical provider's office, for example, there were images, there were forms, there was a front desk that was super hetero and cisnormative. That also extended, of course, to websites and kind of any promotional materials. There was also a lack of LGBTQ plus providers and decision makers that the individuals I spoke to were interacting with. They often felt like they didn't see themselves represented in positions of power or within these medical communities. And then finally, I think this last one maybe is was at least a little bit more new for me. A lot of the individuals we spoke to raised this idea of there historically has been an HIV emphasis. So an emphasis on HIV services for gay cisgender men. So that's a hugely important issue. It has been, it continues to be, but that has long overshadowed the needs of LGBTQ plus women and non-binary individuals in certain spaces. And that's a gap that we can see, that we have seen in LA and that we continue to see. On the theme of the gap theme of LGBTQ plus competency and gatekeeping. So this came in the form of stories about misinformation, discrimination, a frequent need to explain oneself to a provider, that, this idea of that going to the doctor didn't feel like a safe space. It didn't feel like a space that was accepting, and needing to explain oneself. And then this experience of medical providers acting as gatekeepers, and by that meaning, right, medical providers without asking, making assumptions based on someone's gender identity, sexual orientation, about what procedures or supports might be applicable to that individual. And I think this quote demonstrates that. We heard from Gia that medical staff don't think there is a need for a conversation around family planning for trans people. There is an assumption that we have no intention to have families or bear children. So I think a powerful demonstration of what that means to have a medical provider acting as a gatekeeper and making assumptions. And then moving on to this other theme, this other gap that we uncovered around funding inequality. So, kind of two very similar sub-themes here: disparate funding and a lack of funding. So, disparate funding within LGBTQ plus communities, so between different gender identities or sexual orientations. Also a lack of funding for organizations focused on communities of color, a lack of funding for organizations in geographic regions beyond typical LGBTQ plus strongholds. So we talked to individuals kind of, it was talking to someone who's out in the San Gabriel Valley, explaining that, yeah, when I lived in West Hollywood, it was a lot easier to access the services I needed. But that has become much harder now that I live out in the San Gabriel Valley. So I think, again, if all of you are familiar with Los Angeles, not surprising, but a pretty dramatic difference, and just noted by many of the interviewees we spoke to. So actually, before I kind of, the context for this quote is that in 2019, there was a big win in this arena, which is that Governor Gavin Newsom approved the creation of the Lesbian, Bisexual, and Queer Women's Health Equity Fund. And it was the first time a state had specifically designated funds for LBQ women's health. And so that was, of course, a great win. And I heard from the individuals who were working on that advocacy just how frequently they had heard this question when they were seeking these funds. But really, like, do you really need money for that? Is that really that big of an issue? So again, I think highlighting right, they were seeking this funding because of a funding issue and funding inequality. And it also highlights this kind of theme of invisibility just kind of the invisibility and lack of representation as well. And the final gap that we kind of honestly touched on in our reproductive justice definition is unaddressed social determinants of health. So we asked every interviewee, what are some of the unique challenges that the community you work with faces in accessing sexual and reproductive health in LA County? We had all expected as the LACRJ to hear an emphasis on issues of racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, et cetera. And those were apparent, but it was actually the challenge of housing that came up in almost every single interview. So I think I was surprised by that. And also then as a resident of LA County, I was not at all surprised. And there were other issues raised here: transportation, instability in employment and schooling. So this is why we're trying to approach this with the reproductive justice framework, right? We're trying to understand all of the things that affect someone's ability to maintain autonomy, to make choices, and access the healthcare that they need. So again, just kind of a quote that I think demonstrates that. Right, speaking to young people who, about sexual and reproductive health, they actually weren't that concerned, or weren't kind of at that moment concerned with sexual and reproductive health, because they were more concerned with other more immediate basic needs. So transitioning now to advocate recommendations and best practices. So really, you'll see a pretty clear line between the gaps identified and the recommendations and best practices here, but we did kind of ask separate questions, although they tie together very clearly in the themes that came up. So the questions we asked were about investments that the interviewees thought needed to be made. We asked how they felt power needed to shift in order for those changes and recommendations to be successful. And we also, not on this slide, but we also asked about best practices. We asked for examples from their organizations of projects that had gone well, that were really, elevating reproductive justice, elevating the needs of their communities. So on the theme of creating visibility and representation, we spoke to the Black AIDS Institute, Marie Fatima there. And so, not surprising, but some very, I think, very strong examples of having people closest to the problem leading So the Black Women in Prep Toolkit out of the Black AIDS Institute, the peer mentorship program where mentors are helping connect their peers to HIV services in LA County. And then under the same theme of creating visibility and representation, from these interviewees, we came up with recommendations for providers. So again, these are from the interviewees, kind of what they felt like needed to happen. And it directly corresponds to the gaps that we spoke about. So creating materials, and that means websites that have diverse individuals, forms that recognize the gender spectrum, et cetera. Growing relationships with non-traditional partners. So we spoke to advocates who were thinking about how to get sexual and reproductive health information into community centers, foster homes, other places that it might not typically be. Leadership pathways. So thinking about how to link frontline staff working with communities in need to positions of power, whether that be through outreach or scholarships. And establishing and empowering advisory bodies. We heard a lot about advisory bodies that worked with different organizations we spoke to in order to provide a lived experience voice for specific communities. For policymakers, these kind of mirror, again, what we said for providers, but obviously on a slightly different level. I'll highlight one here, a couple here that are a little bit different, those last three. So part of what policymakers can do is provide more funding for data to really decrease that invisibility. If we have more data about what the needs are of specific communities, it can really create more visibility. In this case, we were talking about specifically on LGBTQ plus female and non-binary individuals. And then also we heard from the interviewees about kind of these great things that California has put in place, but that have maybe not been fully implemented or enforced. So ensuring the enforcement of California's prohibition on sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination, ensuring implementation of inclusive sex ed. So on this other next theme of promoting LGBTQ plus competency, again, highlighting the trainings that we came across or that we heard about from the interviewees we spoke to. And so these were spaces in which medical providers and others could learn about health disparities, could kind of get some tips on inclusive care, could better understand terminology. And those were provided across a number of the organizations we spoke to. And so, unsurprisingly, the recommendations that people provided were to provide further training, to encourage further training at places that hadn't been able to provide it, for medical staff, for administrative workers who are in mental and physical health spaces, and then mandatory training, from a policymaker level for county medical staff, admin staff, other frontline service staff. On the goal of alleviating funding inequality, again, I mentioned the LBQ Women's Health Equity Fund, which was a great example of hugely successful coalition work. I encourage you to look it up. And then we also heard from organizations that were able to increase visibility by doing their own needs assessments. And of course, had they had more money, these needs assessments could be that much stronger. So thinking about recommendations for providers about providers and policymakers about funding to tailor services, and for policymakers thinking about funding further research to demonstrate needs more broadly. And that necessity of data disaggregation to show the needs of specific communities, of people at specific intersections. And then finally, on social determinants of health, our recommendations. First, our best practices, just this idea of working across different, different cause areas. So here, this example of actually training medical professionals who are working with trans individuals to be able to connect those individuals to legal services, and also to connect them to other services like those listed below. So we saw examples of that, but again, kind of in the recommendations we are encouraging providers to continue to do that, to continue to build those relationships across cause areas and break down those silos. And then for policymakers to facilitate kind of opportunities for that sort of community and alliance building. And then also more directly to focus on social determinants of health by stopping arrests for prostitution, advocating for healthcare for all, protecting current affordable housing, and growing affordable housing stock. So I would say that, again, these recommendations aren't totally out of left field. We've kind of heard them before. I think something that feels a little bit different here is again, this reproductive justice lens of, yes, we're talking about sexual and reproductive health, but in order to do that, we need to think about housing. We need to think about healthcare for all. So just making sure that we're emphasizing that. We wanted to be sure we were emphasizing that as we spoke to policymakers and other providers. So I am going to pass it over for a little update on, that was all July 2019 to March 2020, that report was published. And unfortunately kind of started to pick up steam right before the world kind of shut down. So we can talk more about that, but I will pass it over for some updates about what's been happening since then.
Thank you, Stina. So since the COVID-19 pandemic first disrupted nearly all aspects of life for all of us, LGBTQ people have been particularly vulnerable, both to the virus itself and the economic social upheaval that it has brought on all our lives. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what have we learned? We're going to look at some numbers here. This was from a survey to the Movement Advancement Project, also known as MAP. 66% of LGBTQ households have had serious financial problems, which can include, but is not limited to, paying utilities like gas or electric, affording medical care, paying credit card bills, loans, or other debt. 29% of LGBTQ households had a serious problem with internet connection to do work or schoolwork at home. 64% of LGBTQ households experienced employment loss, which can include having lost a job or business or have been furloughed, as well as having wages or hours reduced or taking mandatory unpaid leave. 64% also of LGBTQ households had an individual leave the house for non-healthcare work, which then prompted serious concerns about COVID safety. Thank you. 40% of LGBTQ adults work in the 5 industries which have been hardest hit by COVID. That includes restaurants and food services, hospitals, K-12 education, colleges and universities, and retail. Not to mention a majority of Americans' healthcare is tied to their employment. 38% of LGBTQ households have been unable to get medical care or delayed getting medical care for a serious problem. Research finds that LGBTQ people, particularly people of color and those raising children, experience higher rates of economic insecurity and are more likely to face employment discrimination on the job and when seeking jobs. 19%, or nearly 1 in 5 of LGBTQ households, reported that they were not getting enough food to eat every day since the pandemic began. This is again consistent with past research that finds that LGBTQ folks, particularly those of color and those with disabilities, are more likely than their peers to experience food insecurity. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. So SB 932 was introduced in early May of 2020 in response to the state and county's failure to collect and report data about the crisis impact on the LGBTQ community, depriving both the government and community leaders of invaluable information needed to protect the health of LGBTQ Californians. In June 25th of 2020, the California Senate passed an emergency bill requiring COVID-19 LGBTQ data collection. It was authored by Senator Scott Wiener and co-sponsored by Equality California. And SB 932 would require the state, county health officials, and providers to report data illustrating how COVID-19 is impacting the community. In July of 2020, Governor Newsom's office announced that they would begin collecting data for all reportable communicable diseases. Because the LGBTQ community has historically been overlooked by our public health infrastructure, SB 92 will codify that policy into law. It will help people get better health resources and support they need. It was approved by Governor Newsom in September 26th of 2020. Moving on to 2021 with the Delta variant, serious financial problems saw a decrease from 66% to 52%. Challenges navigating and having children increased to 58%. That includes LGBTQ households with children in K through 12. It was also reported that their children fell behind, and 46% reported serious problem meeting both their work and family responsibilities. As far as greater employment disruption, saw a decrease to 61% of LGBTQ households that had experienced employment loss. And since, folks are starting to go back to work after everything that's going on, in terms of workplace safety, 91% of employed LGBTQ folks said their employer did not require employees at their workplace to be vaccinated. 28% of LGBTQ households were still unable to get medical care for a serious problem, and 64% of LGBTQ households with children have had a serious problem with mental health, such as depression, anxiety, stress, or sleeping. So where do we go from here? Reiterating what was recommended in the report in the area of identified gaps, how can we improve? So one, we can create visibility and representation. We need to ensure that the people with lived experiences are at the table. We need to build advisory bodies and integrate community members into standing leadership roles and ensure implementation of California's requirement for sex education inclusivity. Two, we can promote LGBTQ plus competency. We have identified a gap in the LGBTQ competency among medical providers, social workers, and other healthcare professionals. Throughout history, LGBTQ patients have been abused and exploited by the healthcare system and healthcare providers. Patients are at higher risk for poor health outcomes and violence. Representation matters, and as patients are becoming more visible in the healthcare system, they deserve compassion and respect. LGBTQ people need access to reproductive health care. There needs to be access to contraception, abortion, assisted reproductive services, HIV care, pregnancy care, parenting resources, and more. Although many people consider abortion and contraception and pregnancy to be a women's issue, many LGBTQ folks, including lesbian and bisexual women, transgender men, two-spirit, intersex, non-binary, and gender non-conforming individuals can get pregnant, use contraception, have abortions, carry pregnancies, and parent. Three, we need to alleviate funding inequality. We need to fund services for groups and geographies that have not previously been prioritized, including BIPOC voices. Four, we need to emphasize social detriments of health. In centering reproductive justice, we have to remember how everything is connected. For example, when we heard how housing insecurity was a main health detriment in respondents, it can affect their reproductive health. How can they parent in safe communities when there's no affordable housing or lack of childcare services? We also need to stop arrests for prostitution, loitering, and crimes of survival that often target sex workers and trans folks. We need to advocate for healthcare for all. LGBTQ people are more likely to be underinsured and uninsured, and cost is a major barrier in accessing care. With that, I will bring it back to Stina to help answer any questions you all may have.
Yeah, Paula and Frankie, we're happy to answer any questions. I don't know, I'll let you run this.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for an excellent presentation. And Frankie has put into the chat the report if people would want more details. I would like to start off the questions and then open it up to the audience. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about what exactly is in this new funding package from that Newsom signed.
The 2019, the LBQ Women's Health Equity Fund.
Right.
I actually, embarrassingly, will tell you that I used to know more about this, and I don't know. I don't have the details in front of me, so I could pull it up, but I embarrassingly, again, because I was kind of in the weeds of this report in 2019, 2020, I did not read up on that prior.
No worries.
So I
No worries.
apologize, but I don't have more details,
Maybe
but I encourage everyone to look it up.
Yeah, or does Sochi or does anyone in the audience can help us with this?
We can follow up and send that information. Like Stina said, since this report came out almost 2 years ago, like it was so fresh in her mind. And now, you know, what is 2 years into the pandemic?
I totally understand. No worries. Another quick question before I open it up to the audience. I was wondering, when you were talking about like invisibility or you know, in health facilities, for instance, do you think that it would make sense for providers to actually be wearing any, like, you know, sometimes they wear buttons or there's signs on doors and things of that nature, or were there any specifics, I guess, that came out that people were talking about?
I think that could be valuable, but I think what, you know, this was more of just kind of like, what does it feel like to walk into a waiting room and to see yourself either represented or not? And so I think it was obviously an individual provider could kind of maybe, I didn't hear about that actually in this instance, but I have heard about that in other instances of medical providers kind of having some sort of pin or some sort of kind of imagery that indicates kind of their inclusivity and their celebration of kind of whatever it may be, different gender identities, sexual orientations, gender expressions. But I think this was like, in some ways, that much more basic about like, does the form, like, does the form allow me to fill in who I am? You know, can I mark down that I am non-binary? Can I, and like, right, there are lots of stipulations about what is supposed to be in California in medical offices and in, you know, both mental and physical health spaces. But the reality is different. And also just kind of in the, you know, there are a lot of default images of in, for example, maybe a gynecological office to a hetero cis couple. And so just also the kind of like, what are the images that we're seeing on a website when we first walk into an office, all of that. But yeah, I agree with you that I think there are, of course, also spaces for providers to have some sort of kind of representation of their openness.
I would also add to that is in the abortion funding world, we have made a conscious decision to start using non-gendered language when it comes to abortion care. So you might have heard when people say pregnant people, those who can carry a pregnancy, and it's to alleviate that gendered women's issue, or this is only for people that, you know, are perceived to have a uterus and can carry a pregnancy or terminate a pregnancy and parent. And we've made conscious decisions to move to that, although we're not all there. You know, there are still some organizations who, you know, still have women's health, even though they acknowledge that there is a non-gendered approach to that and that it's all inclusive.
Great. So, so let's open it up to the audience. So you're welcome to raise your hand and we can call on you, or you can also post something in the chat, a question in the chat, and then our speakers can address it. So I see there is a question now in the chat. And it is, how do you respond to critics of survival crime theory who argue that those who call for the decriminalization of crimes of survival, I presume they're referring to like sex work, are giving way to a slippery slope of applications of criminal justice law? Do either of you want
That's a
to
good one.
address that?
I will say to that, and like my personal experience and opinion on that is, it's the way it is worded when it comes to how the media talks about that, how people write articles. You'll remember in back at Hurricane Katrina, all the images of Black and brown people looting, and they were getting bread, and yet then they showed white people having essentials and they're surviving. And so it's all in how it's phrased. And that theory that, homeless and poor and people of color commit these crimes and low-level infractions just to secure their basic survival is powerful. It shows the inequalities that are happening because of lack of affordable housing, healthcare, all these detriments that come together. And I think we're going to start seeing a lot more of that. And as well as, with people being forced out of their homes. And I didn't know, Stina, you had anything you wanted to say on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think this like gets us into a realm that is, we could have a whole other lecture series on this question, I think. But I think this idea that, first of all, we know places that have legalized sex work. We know that those places, those countries that have done it have not experienced a slippery slope. We know that this was the same argument that was used when marijuana legalization was discussed and all of that. And I agree that there are so frequently, there are incredible racist undertones to any discussion of this in the media. And I think, yeah, we could have a whole other conversation about this, but I think we have examples of how this just isn't true. And we know that sex work will happen, whether it's legal or not. And there are there's also, from a human rights standpoint and from a regulations, this is getting way out of our report, but from a regulation and human rights standpoint, that there could, that sex workers, and this is a controversial topic that we could get into, but that sex workers could actually benefit and be protected by the legalization of sex work. And that could outweigh other risks as well.
Thank you. I see there is another comment or question in the chat from Allison Clement, and she says, thanks so much for the great presentation. It aligns with what our team has heard from trans and non-binary folks in LA, as well as in teams of medical provider training. How can we reach physicians, nurses, et cetera, who need this training the most to avoid preaching to the choir? Any ideas other than offering CMEs and working upstream on medical and nursing school curriculums?
I think part of what we were thinking, when we had this provider recommendation, we had this policymaker recommendation, and I think part of what needs to happen is advocacy on this broader level, because if the county is mandating for example, for all of their employees that they're getting some type of training, that is a huge swath of individuals who might not otherwise pursue that training. So I think that's one of the ways, but I agree that it's also, in curriculums, in med schools, in nursing school. But I think, yeah, it's trying to access that, what systems can we advocate? Can we advocate to the county? Can we advocate to large healthcare systems to get them to educate all of their staff? As much as we can use that advocacy voice to really get at broader systems rather than just within individual practices.
Thank you.
I would also add on that one is just talking about it. There's also some legislative bills that have been trying to go through legislative session this year. And with that, it's met by a lot of anti-trans folks and education, and don't put that in our schools, don't put that on medical forms. So it would just be to kind of follow that as well.
Thank you. And there's another question in the chat. This is from Caroline Christ, and she says, what are some actions Angelenos who don't work in the reproductive justice space can take in light of the findings of the report to push for further inclusion?
Well, I think in any space that you are in, right, you can push, thinking about like we have been kind of addressing a lot of recommendations to medical providers, to mental health and physical health providers. And a lot of those recommendations are geared towards those individuals. But I think, and those aren't necessarily reproductive, medical providers who are working on reproductive or sexual health, but more broadly than that. So thinking about like, as a reproductive justice issue, this touches everything. So it is for those providers and those social workers, but it's also a recommendation, right? That we have seen similar recommendations for schools, for other systems that I guess like, lots of individuals are interacting with. But I also think there's room, right, as a concerned citizen to advocate with policymakers. And so to seek out, I would encourage you, if you're kind of interested in advocacy in LA on these issues, you could go to that list of organizations that we interviewed and reach out. A lot of those organizations have opportunities to volunteer and to advocate and to do community organizing alongside them.
Great, thank you. And then there's another question. This is from Catherine Barker, and she writes, thank you for your work on this. Given the stated need for secure housing, could you provide an update on what is being done in LA to address, incorporate social determinants of health, such as housing, into reproductive health? Are there efforts to handle these health concerns institutionally, or are things still relatively siloed?
I can actually answer that one. So, in terms of like, for instance, like the housing issue and how this one came about, this question, like there are organizations already doing this work, and it's going to be like to try and find them and uplift them and follow their work. So the California Latinas for Reproductive Justice recently has been trying to stabilize rent in Bell Gardens, which would be the first in LA County. And what they're seeing there is a 10% increase every year for rent. And it has an over 80% of renters in that area. So they're actually doing, I believe it's actually today, that they're going to go to like the city council and have a big broad of support in terms of like stabilizing the rent. And if they can stabilize it in Bell Gardens, then it will have implications of doing it elsewhere, and that other cities can follow through, because they're seeing that most of the people that are becoming homeless are parents. And what's happening then is it's just spiraling. So now they're homeless, their kids go into CPS, now they're in the system, now they're given a stipend to another family in a well-off neighborhood to raise their children. So it all comes down, it's so connected. But I will get that information over to Frankie so he can share that.
Great. Stina, did you want to respond also to that, or? But it was a key finding that housing, whatever you're discussing, seems to be coming up so strongly. Do Do we have any other questions from the audience? So I guess I have a final question, just kind of now the report's out there. Are you trying to engage like legislators on some of these issues, or have you circulated it? I mean, how are you working with this report?
So, right, we did that initial circulation, and we had kind of way back when had started sharing it with different bodies and policymakers. And it truthfully went nowhere. I think now is a good moment to lift this up. I actually think like right today feels like a good moment to lift this up. I actually thank you, Dr. Tavro, Frankie, for bringing us here today, because I actually also think it's gotten like LACRJ, the coalition, has been working on loads of other things during COVID. And this, I think, has re-elevated this report that we put a lot of work into a while ago. And I think it's still, though it was written now a while ago, it still holds true as far as we know. I think it really can be re-elevated. So, right, our previous plan that we can kind of like go back to was to talk to the Board of Supervisors, to talk to City Council members, to talk to, right, I remember we had like set up meetings with LA Domestic Violence Coalition, some other kind of coalition bodies to try and really build some noise around this. So hopefully we can reactivate that effort.
Great.
It also helped start conversations with the County of Los Angeles and like the Board of Supervisors. So the County of Los Angeles Health Department came out with a report in March that has strictly talking about abortion issues and abortion access in LA County. And it kind of springs off of where this report came from, you know, although supported by the board, was led by an independent coalition. And it's, you know, starting to be able to use that as reference material, as well as legislation that's going on right now. The Future of Abortion Council has 14 bills going through that support reproductive justice organizations that are doing the work and trying to get education out there, and that's inclusive as well.
Well, thank you, both of you. And actually on that note, I just want everyone to be aware that on May 27th, Friday, from 2 to 3:30, we are sponsoring a major webinar of 5 of the most active organizations, abortion rights organizations, to discuss what they've been doing in California on the future of abortion. And if you haven't gotten that announcement, just send a message over to Frankie and he will make sure that you see it. But Frankie, maybe you can just put your email address into the chat. Also on abortion, on May 19th, we're going to be sponsoring Carrie White, who is living in Texas and has been studying the impact of the Texas abortion law on access in Texas. And she's also done some work in Mississippi, which she says, when I interviewed her about this, she said, Mississippi is already post-Roe territory. So she's going to be giving us a perspective from the field, as it were, from those 2 states. And so that'll be on May 19th at noon, and then May 27th from 2 to 3:30 on the future of abortion. So anyway, we're so happy that everyone was able to stay. Thank you so much. And thank you again. If we can just give a round of applause to our 2 presenters. They really gave a very comprehensive report to us today. Thank you so much.